Well, thank you so much. I'm really pleased and delighted to come up from Florida to be with you all tonight here in Atlanta to commemorate, as you've just heard, and you'll hear again and again and again, the 50th anniversary of the historic Nostra Aetate Declaration. I'm especially very grateful and delighted to be with Archbishop Wilton Gregory. He and I met some years ago when we had a conference at Mundelein College near Chicago in Illinois, and I knew then, as I know now, that he was a man blessed with great leadership quality, and I'm delighted that he served not only as the president of the American Bishops from 2001 to 2004, but also was very much a leader in interreligious activities for the Catholic bishops. And now, of course, for the last 11 years, he's been your Archbishop here in Atlanta. I'm very, very appreciative of the extraordinary efforts that were expended by so many people to make this event so successful. I want to especially single out my colleagues at the American Jewish Committee. I want to wave the flag for just a minute, led by Dov Wilker and Harold Hirschberg. They deserve many, many thanks, but so many other people were involved. I want to take a moment, just a little point of personal privilege. I'm a longtime baseball fan, and as a youngster growing up in Alexandria, Virginia, it was my misfortune to be a fan of the most miserable team in the American League then, called the Washington Senators. I even dreamed of, if you can imagine, playing second base for them. In fact, I would have been better than some of the second basemen who played them. Now, when you root for a losing team, there's a religious aspect to it. It's called the chastisements of God. Now, when I became an adult, I spent most of my life in New York City, but my neurotic, psychotic pattern increased. I became an ardent New York Mets fan. And now, Archbishop Gregory, in a spirit of confession, I must tell you that every time the Mets played the Atlanta Braves, year after year after year after year, it was more pain, more suffering for me. But as Christians and Jews, we believe in Geulah, the Hebrew word for redemption. And this year has been different. The Mets, once the lowly, hapless Mets, are in the World Series, and my suffering has ended at long last. And for all of you who are Braves fans, and there might be a few here tonight, I don't know, remember the words of the Hebrew prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 6, to be asirei hatikvah, be prisoners of hope. There's always next year. I don't think we can understand, much less celebrate, what happened 50 years ago, the clergy and lay here tonight, without understanding the context of that time, and part of that video showed it. On October 25th, 1959, a little more than 3 months after his election, Pope John XXIII called for a Vatican Council. He used these words, which I quote, "Let me throw open the windows of the church and let the fresh air of the Spirit blow through." John XXIII knew that those windows that he opened would not be open for long, but he said, let's call together the bishops of the world for a Vatican Council to address many of the problems that had developed. Now remember, it was 1962 to 65 that the Vatican Council took place, the height of the Cold War. Remember, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of the first and only president who was a Catholic, John F. Kennedy, the emerging civil rights movement in which Atlanta played such a major, major role. It was only 15 years since modern Israel achieved its independence as the only Jewish state in the world in 1948. And it was less than 20 years since the end of the Shoah, the Holocaust, the mass murder of 6 million Jews in the heart of what Pope John Paul II accurately called the heart of Christian Europe. And then add to all that was modernity, the scientific, psychological, technological, economic, cultural, and social forces that were all impacting all of us, but especially the Roman Catholic Church. And think what that 20th century has brought us. Nazism, fascism, communism, not one but two world wars, much of it fought in Europe. The atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, Sputnik, and so much more. And so John the 23rd called together the bishops of the world to come to Rome over a period of 3 years and to face those challenges. And above all, he wanted to forge the church's new relationship with Judaism and the Jewish people. John the 23rd had been during World War II a nuncio, an ambassador of the Vatican, particularly in Paris, but he also served in Greece and he served also in Turkey. And he called together and he saw firsthand the Shoah, the Holocaust in Europe. It's important to also remember that at Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, 4 future popes, 4, count them, were there. Paul VI as bishops, John Paul I, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. More than 2,900 bishops were invited. Here was the problem, and I'll move as quickly as I can. 3 words you should remember. 4 words. The teaching, 3 words. The teaching of contempt. That's 4. I went to a rather poor school in Virginia. But this was the heart of the matter. For centuries, it was documented, and the American Jewish Committee played a very important part, and the American Catholic Church was very, very helpful and instrumental in this, that somehow Judaism was a surplus religion following the rise of Christianity, and that even though Jesus was a Jew living in the land of Israel, and his early followers were Jews, and the Hebrew Bible was the only scripture that he knew. And remember the 2 great commandments that Jesus taught. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might, and love your neighbor as yourself, are from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And even though the New Testament was written primarily by Jews, perhaps maybe the Gospel of Luke was not, and it was written primarily for Jews, and it was written about one particular Jew, still the prevalent belief was that Jews had failed to recognize the Messiah, and as a result, Judaism was an extraneous religion, subject to contempt. And for over 1,900 years, there were tragically horrific attacks, both physical and theological and psychological. But Jews and Judaism did not disappear. And John the 23rd knew that, and this was what he wanted to address at the Vatican Council. Now, let me just put in parentheses, it was not all darkness those 1,900 years between Catholics and Jews. There were many areas of coexistence and of sunshine. You saw on the screen that the obscene deicide charge had been addressed and was addressed by Nostra Aetate, that somehow the Jews were responsible deliberately for the Roman execution of Jesus of Nazareth. Now let me be clear, deicide was never a part of Catholic dogma and teaching. But it was, as my grandparents made very clear, it was held by many, many Christians as a kind of popular belief. And they remember pogroms and persecutions that they experienced in Central and Eastern Europe before they escaped and came to Pennsylvania. It was a widely held popular belief, and Vatican II addressed that very clearly. Then there was the question of anti-Semitism, which again, John the 23rd wanted addressed by name. And that term, a modern term, which means the hatred of Jews and Judaism. And the bishops at the Vatican Council were very aware of what anti-Semitism had meant in the 20th century. How could they not be aware of it? It was only 1965. They knew that anti-Semitism and its murderous consequences was one of the chief features of the Nazi regime. And many Catholic leaders, especially in the United States, were filled with contrition for the role the Christian teaching and preaching had played for centuries, this teaching of contempt. And they were committed to overturning that. And then finally, there was the question, the persistent nagging question of conversion. They faced the issue, was Judaism merely the forerunner of Christianity? Or was it in fact an eternal religious tradition that Christianity needed to live with and come to terms with? Did Jews need to become Christians to be saved? Let me put it another way. Perhaps, think about it, and the Vatican Council made us think about it, perhaps it was God's plan, after all, that there are many ways to achieve theological salvation, many paths to God. And Nostra Aetate, in our time, said, we must build mutual respect and understanding between Catholics and Jews. Because every other approach had failed. Forced conversions, expulsions, inquisitions, pogroms had all been tried. And yet, Judaism and Christianity endured into the 1960s in a kind of tenuous coexistence. I think all of you would have agreed it would have been easy for the Catholic bishops, a slam dunk, we would say, in basketball, to chart a new path and build new bridges of solidarity and positive relationships. But it was not easy to achieve. Great things, great historical things, do not come easily. And so it required 3 years, several draft statements, new texts, compromise, accommodation, revisions, changes. Finally, as you heard today, 50 years ago, October 28, 1965, Pope Paul VI promulgated Nostra Aetate. And I want to close by commending the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, both clergy and lay, who worked very hard because they knew Jews in this country face to face, not as abstractions, not as candidates for conversion, not as some metaphysical creations. They knew them as partners, friends, neighbors, schoolmates, classmates, face to face. And when the vote came in 1965, it was not even close. 2,221 bishops in favor of Nostra Aetate, 88 against, and it was adopted. The text is in your program. It's only 624 words long. And the critics of the time said, oh, it's great, great what the bishops did, but it didn't go far enough. And I want to end by saying, yeah, it didn't go far enough because it didn't really mention the Holocaust, didn't mention the state of Israel, but to the credit of the Catholic Church and Jewish leaders who worked together with them, since 1965, there have been many statements, notes, guidelines, teachings, declarations, and the establishment of diplomatic relations between the State of Israel and Vatican in 1993. Yesterday, when I was with Archbishop Gregory and others, I quoted a colleague of his, Cardinal Walter Kasper of the Vatican, a great leader in Catholic-Jewish relations, a German Catholic. Cardinal Kasper said, Nostra Aetate and all that followed from it for the first 50 years was not and is not the beginning of the end of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, poor relations between Christians and Jews, not the beginning of the end. Cardinal Kasper was very wise. He said, It's the beginning of the beginning. And so it is. And so that is why we celebrate, and that is why we commemorate. 50 years in the sight of Catholics and Jews is but as yesterday. We have so much more work to do. Let me close, and really close, with the opening line from Robert Browning, who was the poet, of course, who was neither a Catholic nor a Jew. But he wrote a poem you all studied, you all must have studied in high school or college, called Rabbi Ben Ezra. And I want to read the opening line, and then you heard some great singing. I want you to repeat that line along with me. Robert Browning wrote, and this is our task as Jews and Christians 50 years later. Browning wrote, "Grow old along with me. The best is yet to be." So will you say it with me? Grow old along with me. The best